Hello, my name's Luke. I'm one of the fifth year medical students at ICSM, and I'm going to be talking today about preeclampsia. I've divided this talk into 4 parts. So we'll start with defining it, talking about the epidemiology and the risk factors. Then in part 2, we'll talk about how it presents and what the mechanisms underlying it are. And part 3 will be about complications for mother and baby. And finally, we'll talk about diagnosis and how it's managed. So preeclampsia is defined as maternal hypertension detected at 20 weeks gestation or later with either proteinuria or maternal organ dysfunction. Now, the reason we use the 20-week cutoff is because preeclampsia takes a while to develop, and the signs of it will, as a rule, never be seen before 20 weeks. So screening for it before then is a bit pointless. Proteinuria can be detected with a urine dipstick, but for quantifying it, we need to carry out a PCR. That's a protein to creatinine ratio, and that's a form of urine analysis. We used to use 24-hour urine collection, but that's quite a time-consuming and messy way to do it, so now we use PCR. The reason maternal organ dysfunction is a criteria for preeclampsia is that some women might not be picked up on screening and might instead present just with the complications of preeclampsia, and that criterion allows them to be diagnosed with it based on hypertension plus symptoms of the complications. It's worth mentioning that some definitions will say new onset maternal hypertension at 20 weeks gestation or later. The problem with this is it excludes women who had chronic hypertension before they got pregnant, and that's actually a cohort that's at increased risk of preeclampsia, so it doesn't seem wise to exclude them. It's also worth mentioning that edema used to be part of the definition for preeclampsia and is a symptom, but it's too common in normal pregnancy to be very useful in diagnosing it. In terms of the epidemiology, it's thought to cause between 50 and 80,000 maternal deaths worldwide per year. This disproportionately affects lower income countries. So it's associated with a lot of morbidity and mortality for both mothers and babies. And depending on where you go in the world, maternal mortality can be between 50 and 5%. And in some cases, it can be higher than 50%, depending on what population you look at. And it's more common in people of African origin. So now to risk factors. It complicates around 5% of pregnancies, but that can be anywhere between about 2 and 8%, depending on where you are in the world. It's less common in multiples unless they have a prior history of it. If they've had prior preeclampsia or an intrauterine growth restricted pregnancy, then they're at more risk of having another preeclamptic pregnancy. And the reason IUGR is linked to it is because it shares a similar mechanism to preeclampsia, but we'll talk about that later. Increased maternal age is a risk factor for most obstetric conditions, and it is for preeclampsia as well, as is family history, a high BMI, and multiple pregnancies, so being pregnant with twins or more. Pregnancy interval, so having 2 babies more than 10 years apart, increases the risk of preeclampsia in that second pregnancy, and that's to do with the mechanism of developing preeclampsia, which we'll talk about later, and autoimmune diseases such as SLE and antiphospholipid syndrome are also associated. Now, this is just a graph from a BMJ meta-analysis, and this shows the increase in risk of preeclampsia with certain conditions. So you can see down at the bottom, if you have antiphospholipid syndrome, APL, then your risk of preeclampsia is pretty significantly increased. Whereas if you compare that to the increase in risk for nulliparity or maternal age over 35, they're fairly small. And as you can see, chronic hypertension increases the risk fairly significantly, which is another reason why women with chronic hypertension shouldn't be excluded from the definition of preeclampsia. So saying new onset hypertension isn't necessarily very useful. This graph is a bit of a reverse of the prior one. So this takes a cohort of preeclampsia patients, and the size of the bars corresponds to how many people within that cohort have that risk factor. So even though nulliparity here was actually quite a small risk factor from the prior graph, because it's so common, it's associated with a lot of cases of preeclampsia. And by contrast, if you look at APL, antiphospholipid syndrome on this graph, it's got quite a small bar, because even though if a patient has it, they're at much higher risk of developing preeclampsia, it's really quite rare.